The tragic tale of a Maryland teen. Anger, desperation. In the quiet suburbs of Maryland, a shocking incident unfolded that would test the limits of family dynamics, judicial compassion, and the complexities of adolescent emotions. The case involved a teenage girl, whom we will call Emily, who found herself at the center of a horrific act against her father, an incident that was as startling as it was heartbreaking. Emily, a 16-year-old high school student, was the only child of her parents. Her mother had divorced her father several years ago and moved to Ohio, where she remarried and started a new life. Emily's father, John, a single parent, struggled to balance his responsibilities as a parent with his own personal demons. He had a history of alcohol abuse, a problem that had worsened over the years, particularly after the divorce. Despite the challenges, Emily and her father had a complex but loving relationship. Emily was an avid tennis player, and her father, though often struggling with his own issues, made every effort to support her passion. However, his alcoholism frequently interfered with his ability to be the reliable parent Emily needed. On a typical weekday evening, Emily's frustration reached a boiling point. She had a crucial tennis practice scheduled, and her father had promised to take her. However, when she came home from school, she found her father passed out on the couch, reeking of alcohol. This was not an unusual sight, but on this particular day, it was the final straw. Emily's anger and desperation combined in a lethal mix. She felt abandoned and let down once again by the person she depended on most. In a fit of rage, she decided to take drastic action. She grabbed a nearby object, a heavy vase, and struck her father repeatedly while he lay unconscious on the couch. The attack was brutal, and John suffered severe injuries, including a fractured skull and multiple lacerations. Miraculously, he did not die, but the injuries were life-altering. Emily, realizing what she had done, was overcome with guilt and horror. She called 911, reporting the incident and confessing to the crime. Emily was taken into custody and charged with attempted murder and aggravated assault. The case drew significant media attention due to its shocking nature and the fact that a teenage girl had committed such a violent act against her own father. As the trial approached, Emily's defense team, led by experienced attorneys, began to build a case that would highlight the mitigating circumstances. They argued that Emily's actions, though indefensible, were a result of years of emotional and psychological abuse suffered at the hands of her father's neglect and alcoholism. The prosecution, however, pushed for severe penalties, citing the gravity of the injuries inflicted and the premeditated nature of the attack. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their cases, each trying to sway the judge's decision. A critical component of Emily's defense was the psychological evaluation conducted by forensic psychiatrists. These experts testified that Emily suffered from severe emotional distress and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, due to her father's chronic abuse and neglect. They explained that Emily's actions on that fateful day were not those of a cold-blooded assailant, but of a desperate and traumatized teenager. Dr. Sarah Johnson, a leading forensic psychiatrist, testified that Emily's behavior was a culmination of years of feeling abandoned, unloved, and unsupported. She emphasized that Emily's relationship with her father was complex and multifaceted, marked by both love and intense anger. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Thompson, was known for his compassionate yet firm approach to justice. After hearing all the evidence and testimonies, he decided to take an unconventional route. Recognizing the unique circumstances of the case and the mitigating factors presented by the defense, Judge Thompson opted for judicial leniency. Emily was granted immunity from prosecution under a special provision that allowed for leniency in cases where the defendant had suffered significant abuse or neglect. The judge ruled that Emily's actions, though criminal, were a direct result of the traumatic environment she had been forced to endure. The decision was met with mixed reactions from the public and the media. Some hailed it as a landmark ruling that acknowledged the complexities of family dynamics and the long-term effects of abuse, while others criticized it as too lenient. Emily, however, was given a second chance. She was placed in a rehabilitation program designed for young offenders, where she received intensive therapy and counseling. The program aimed to address her trauma, teach her coping mechanisms, and help her rebuild her life. John, Emily's father, also underwent treatment for his alcoholism and began the long process of healing and reconciliation with his daughter. Though his physical injuries were severe, he recognized that his daughter's actions were a cry for help and a reflection of the failures in their relationship. Reconciliation and healing. The road to healing was long and arduous for both Emily and her father. They attended family therapy sessions together, working through their issues and rebuilding their relationship. Emily learned to manage her anger and frustration in healthier ways, while John worked tirelessly to overcome his addiction and become a more reliable and supportive parent. As time passed, Emily resumed her tennis practice, this time with a newfound appreciation for her father's efforts to support her. She excelled in school and began to see a future beyond the trauma of her past. John, now sober and more involved in Emily's life, found joy in watching his daughter thrive. Conclusion. The case of Emily and her father stands as a poignant reminder of the complexities of human relationships and the far-reaching consequences of abuse and neglect. It highlights the importance of judicial compassion and the need for rehabilitation over punishment in certain cases. Emily's story is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for healing and forgiveness. It shows that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path towards redemption and a second chance at building a better, healthier life. In the end, Emily's act of violence against her father was not just a crime, it was a desperate cry for help from a teenager who felt forgotten and abandoned. Her journey, though marked by tragedy, ultimately led to healing, reconciliation, and a newfound hope for a brighter future. The tragic echo of South New York, a grandmother's desperate act. It was a chilly autumn evening in 1933, in the small town of South New York, where a sense of unease settled over the residents of Elm Street. The tranquility of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of a gunshot, followed by the eerie silence that often precedes tragedy. The source of the disturbance was the humble abode of the Watson family, where a grandmother's love had turned to unspeakable violence. The events that unfolded on that fateful day would forever etch a dark memory in the minds of those who knew the Watsons. The family, consisting of 75-year-old matriarch Agnes Watson, her 53-year-old daughter Margaret, and Margaret's 25-year-old son James, had always been a tight-knit one. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary lives, a cauldron of tension and resentment had been brewing. The trouble began when James, a hot-headed and impulsive young man, got into an altercation with his mother, Margaret. The exact details of the argument are unclear, but it is believed to have started over a trivial matter, possibly related to James's joblessness and his mother's frustration with his lack of motivation. The dispute escalated, with James becoming increasingly aggressive and violent. In a fit of rage, he physically assaulted his mother, nearly beating her to death. Margaret, a petite woman with a frail constitution, was left battered and bruised, her body covered in cuts and welts. Her mother, Agnes, who had been watching the scene unfold from the next room, was horrified by what she saw. The sight of her daughter, whom she loved dearly, being brutalized by her own grandson, was too much for Agnes to bear. In a state of shock and despair, Agnes stumbled into her bedroom, where she kept a small antique revolver for protection. With shaking hands, she loaded the gun and made her way back to the living room, where James was still standing over his mother's battered body. Without hesitation, Agnes pointed the gun at James and fired a single shot, striking him in the chest. The young man crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. As he lay dying, Agnes stood over him, the gun still clutched in her hand, her face etched with a mixture of grief and determination. Margaret, still recovering from her ordeal, stumbled to her feet and rushed to her son's side. She cradled his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies and words of comfort to her dying child. Agnes, meanwhile, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the scene before her, as if unable to comprehend the gravity of her actions. The neighbors, alerted by the sound of the gunshot, began to gather outside the Watson residence. They were met with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A young man lying dead on the floor, his mother weeping over him, and his grandmother standing nearby, the gun still clutched in her hand. The police were called, and soon the Watson home was swarming with officers and detectives. Agnes, still in shock, was taken into custody and charged with the murder of her grandson. As she was led away in handcuffs, she caught a glimpse of her daughter, Margaret, who was being tended to by paramedics. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Agnes saw a glimmer of understanding and forgiveness in her daughter's gaze. The trial of Agnes Watson was a sensationalized media event, with newspapers and radio stations across the country covering the story of the grandmother who killed her grandson. The prosecution painted Agnes as a cold-blooded murderer, while the defense argued that she was a loving grandmother who had been driven to madness by the brutality of her grandson's actions. In the end, Agnes was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. As she sat in her cell, she was haunted by the memories of that fateful day. She couldn't shake the image of James lying dead on the floor, or the sound of the gunshot that had ended his life. Margaret, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She never fully recovered from the trauma of that day, and her relationship with her mother was forever changed. Though she visited Agnes in prison and forgave her for her actions, the wound of that day would never fully heal. The tragic incident on Elm Street served as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and violence. It highlighted the complexities of family relationships and the blurred lines between love and hate. As the years went by, the Watson family story became a cautionary tale, whispered about in hushed tones by the residents of South New York, a reminder of the horrors that can unfold when emotions are allowed to boil over. In the end, Agnes Watson's love for her family had turned to tragedy, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned actions can have devastating consequences. Her story would live on, a haunting reminder of the destructive power of violence and the enduring complexity of the human heart.